My granddaughter's words cut through the warm afternoon air like a knife through butter, stopping me dead in my tracks as I watered the petunias by my front porch. "They're only nice when you're watching, Grandma," 8-year-old Sophie whispered, glancing nervously toward the kitchen window where her parents were preparing what they called our weekly family dinner. The innocence in her voice made the statement even more chilling, because children, I've learned in my 74 years on this earth, have an uncanny ability to see through the masks that adults wear so carefully. Her small hand tugged at my gardening glove as she continued. "When you're not there, Mommy calls you mean names, and Daddy says you're trying to control everyone with your money." I felt my heart sink into my stomach, not because I was shocked by this revelation, but because it confirmed every nagging suspicion I'd been harboring for the past 2 years, since my husband Gerald passed away and left me this beautiful house in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado, along with a substantial inheritance that had apparently turned me from beloved family matriarch into a walking ATM machine. You see, I'm Margaret Caldwell, and until that moment on my front porch, I thought I was living in a beautiful fairy tale where my widowed daughter-in-law Jessica and my son Michael had moved in with me to provide companionship and help manage the large Victorian house that Gerald and I had called home for 43 years. They'd painted it as a perfect arrangement when they approached me 18 months ago, explaining how little Sophie needed stability after her grandfather's death, how the expensive rent on their downtown apartment was draining their savings, and how I surely must be lonely, rattling around in this big house all by myself. "Mom, it would be perfect," Michael had said with that charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble since he was Sophie's age. "We could all take care of each other, and Sophie could have her grandmother right there whenever she needs you." Jessica had nodded enthusiastically, adding how much she'd love to help with the cooking and housework, how grateful they'd be for my guidance as they navigated their marriage and parenthood, and how wonderful it would be for Sophie to grow up surrounded by family history and love. The arrangement had seemed like a godsend during those dark months after Gerald's funeral, when the silence in the house felt suffocating and every corner held memories that brought tears to my eyes. Having my family close, hearing Sophie's laughter echoing through the halls, sharing meals around the same dining room table where Gerald and I had celebrated decades of holidays and milestones, it felt like a second chance at the kind of family closeness I'd always dreamed of. Michael had moved his home office into Gerald's old study, Jessica had taken over the kitchen with enthusiasm, and Sophie had transformed the small guest room into a little girl's paradise, complete with stuffed animals and fairy lights. For the first few months, it truly felt like we were building something beautiful together, 3 generations sharing love, wisdom, and daily life in ways that seemed increasingly rare in our fast-paced modern world. Every morning, Jessica would bring me coffee in bed and chat about her plans for the day. Every evening, Michael would sit with me on the front porch, discussing everything from politics to his work as a marketing consultant, and every weekend we'd plan family activities that made Sophie giggle with delight. But as the months passed, subtle changes began to creep into our domestic harmony like shadows lengthening at dusk. Jessica's morning coffee visits became rushed affairs where she'd barely make eye contact before hurrying off to handle some urgent matter. Michael's evening porch conversations shifted from comfortable discussions to carefully worded requests for small favors that somehow always involved money. The grocery bills, which I'd initially offered to cover as my contribution to our shared meals, began including expensive items I'd never requested. Premium steaks, imported wines, organic everything, gourmet snacks that disappeared faster than seemed possible for a family of 3. When I gently mentioned that our weekly grocery budget had doubled, Jessica had laughed it off with a casual, "Oh, you know how prices have gone up everywhere, and we want to make sure you're eating well, Margaret." The utility bills started arriving with usage numbers that seemed astronomical for people who were supposedly trying to be mindful of expenses. But when I brought it up, Michael explained that Jessica's new pottery hobby required keeping the basement workshop heated, and they were sure I understood how important it was for her creative fulfillment. The requests for small favors became a regular drumbeat in our household conversations. Could I help cover Sophie's dance lessons because they'd provide such wonderful exercise and cultural enrichment? Would I mind paying for the family vacation to California because it would create such precious memories for all of us? Could I contribute to the down payment on a new car since Jessica's old sedan was becoming unreliable and unsafe for transporting Sophie? Each request came wrapped in concern for family well-being, expressions of gratitude for my generosity, and promises that this would be the last time they'd need to ask for help. I found myself saying yes over and over again, partly because I genuinely wanted to contribute to their happiness, and partly because saying no felt selfish when I had more money than I could spend in my remaining years. The requests were always presented as family investments, opportunities for us to create shared experiences and ensure everyone's safety and happiness, making it seem petty and unloving to refuse. But something had been nagging at me for weeks before Sophie's revelation on the front porch. A growing sense that the warmth and gratitude I received during our family interactions felt performative, like actors delivering lines they'd rehearsed but didn't really mean. Jessica's hugs lingered a beat too long, as if she was making sure I noticed her affection. Michael's compliments about my wisdom and generosity came at precisely the moments when I'd expressed hesitation about some new expense. Their interest in my stories about the past, their questions about my childhood and my marriage to Gerald, their apparent fascination with family history seemed to spike whenever they were preparing to ask for something significant. Even Sophie, sweet innocent Sophie, had begun to feel like a prop in their performances, brought out to hug Grandma and tell her about school achievements whenever the atmosphere grew tense around financial discussions. The three of them had created a picture of domestic bliss that looked perfect from the outside. But standing there on my front porch with my granddaughter's honest words ringing in my ears, I realized I'd been living inside a carefully constructed illusion designed to keep me compliant and generous. Sophie's revelation opened a floodgate in my mind, and suddenly, every strange interaction, every overheard whisper, every moment that had felt slightly off over the past year began to make perfect sense in a way that made my stomach churn, with a mixture of heartbreak and anger. That very evening, as if the universe was determined to show me the truth I'd been blind to, I witnessed firsthand what my granddaughter had been trying to tell me. I'd gone upstairs early, claiming a headache, but in reality, I needed time to process what Sophie had shared with me and decide how to handle this devastating information. From my bedroom, I could hear their voices drifting up from the kitchen as they cleaned up after dinner, their tones casual and unguarded in a way they never were when they knew I was listening. "I can't believe she actually bought that story about needing new tires." Jessica's voice carried clearly through the old house's thin walls, followed by Michael's low chuckle. "The woman will believe anything if you frame it as being about Sophie's safety or our family's well-being. It's almost too easy." I felt sick to my stomach as their conversation continued, each word confirming my worst fears about how they really viewed me and our living arrangement. Jessica's voice took on a mocking tone as she apparently imitated something I'd said earlier. "Oh, of course, dear. Anything for little Sophie's comfort." Her real voice returned with an edge of contempt. "She's so desperate to feel needed and important that she'll write a check for anything we ask. Did you see how she practically tripped over herself to pay for that ridiculous pottery workshop I made up? I haven't touched clay in my life, but she was so excited about supporting my artistic journey." Michael's response made my hands clench into fists. "The inheritance must be even bigger than we thought if she's not even blinking at these amounts anymore. My old man always was better with money than he let on. We should probably start thinking bigger picture here. Maybe that European trip we talked about, or the investment in your sister's restaurant." The casual way they discussed manipulating my emotions and exploiting my generosity felt like physical blows, each sentence hammering home how completely I'd been deceived by people I'd trusted with my home, my heart, and my financial security. But it was what they said about Sophie that truly shattered my heart into pieces. "We need to coach Sophie better," Jessica said, with the calculating tone of someone planning a business strategy. "She's getting too comfortable, starting to act like she lives here permanently instead of remembering that we're guests who need to stay in Grandma's good graces. Yesterday, she told Margaret about that time you yelled at her for spilling juice on the couch, and I had to do damage control for 20 minutes. Michael's voice grew more serious. "She's just a kid. She doesn't understand the bigger picture here. But you're right. We need to be more careful about what she sees and hears. Maybe we should set up some kind of reward system. Get her to understand that certain conversations stay in the family, The idea that they were planning to manipulate my innocent granddaughter into becoming complicit in their deception made me feel physically ill. This sweet, honest child who had trusted me enough to share the truth was being turned into a tool in their scheme to extract money from her grandmother. As their conversation continued, I learned details about their financial situation that painted a completely different picture from the one they'd presented to me. Michael's marketing consulting business wasn't struggling as he'd claimed. In fact, he'd been turning down projects because he didn't want to work too hard when he had such a comfortable arrangement at my house. Jessica hadn't been looking for part-time work to contribute to the household as she'd promised. Instead, she'd been spending her days shopping, getting spa treatments, and meeting friends for expensive lunches, all funded by the generous allowance I'd been providing for household expenses. The car repairs, the medical bills, the emergency expenses that had prompted so many teary-eyed requests for help had all been fabricated or wildly exaggerated. Even Sophie's dance lessons, which I'd been so proud to support, had been canceled months ago, but they'd continued to collect the monthly payment and use it for their own entertainment. The most devastating part of their conversation came when Jessica started talking about their long-term plans for my house and my finances. The beauty of this setup is that she's getting more dependent on us every day, she said, with the cold calculation of someone who had studied her target carefully. She lights up when Sophie runs to hug her. She loves feeling needed when we ask for her advice about parenting decisions, and she's terrified of being alone in this big house again. Even if she starts to suspect something, she won't want to rock the boat and risk losing her family. Michael agreed, adding, "Plus, at her age, who's going to believe her if she starts claiming we're taking advantage? We look like the perfect family taking care of the elderly grandmother. Everyone will assume she's becoming paranoid or confused if she starts making accusations." They laughed together at their own cleverness, discussing how they'd gradually increase their requests, maybe suggest that I add them to the house deed for estate planning purposes, and ensure that when I passed away, they'd inherit everything as the grieving family members who had sacrificed so much to care for me in my final years. Lying there in my bed, listening to them plot my emotional and financial destruction with the same casual tone they might use to discuss weekend plans, I felt something shift inside me permanently. The grief and shock began to transform into something much more powerful. A cold, clear determination to protect myself and my granddaughter from these manipulative predators who happened to share my blood. They had underestimated me completely, assuming that age and loneliness had made me weak and gullible, not realizing that 74 years of life had also given me wisdom, strength, and the ability to recognize danger when it finally revealed itself. As I lay there in the darkness, listening to them laugh about their scheme, I began to formulate a plan of my own, one that would expose their true nature and protect the inheritance that Gerald and I had worked our entire lives to build. They wanted to play games with a lonely old widow, but they were about to discover that this particular grandmother had learned a few tricks during her decades on Earth. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since Gerald's death, as if hearing their cruel conversation had burned away the fog of grief and loneliness that had made me so vulnerable to their manipulation. Over my morning coffee, which I prepared myself instead of waiting for Jessica's false gesture of kindness, I began to mentally inventory everything I knew about their deception and everything I needed to learn to protect myself completely. The first step was obvious. I needed to gather evidence of their lies and manipulation before confronting them, because people capable of such elaborate emotional fraud wouldn't hesitate to deny everything and twist the situation to make me look like a confused, paranoid elderly woman. I decided to start with their financial claims, the foundation of every sob story and urgent request that had opened my checkbook for the past 18 months. That afternoon, while Michael was supposedly at a client meeting and Jessica was at her fabricated pottery class, I drove to the bank where I'd been writing checks for their various emergencies and requested detailed records of every transaction I'd made on their behalf. The teller, who had known me for decades, was helpful and discreet as we went through the statements together, and seeing the numbers laid out in black and white was shocking, even though I'd written every check myself. In 18 months, I had paid out over $47,000 for their supposed needs. Car repairs that never happened, medical bills for conditions that didn't exist, educational expenses for activities they'd canceled, and household contributions that had funded their secret luxury lifestyle. The pattern was clear once I saw it all together. Small requests in the beginning to test my willingness to help, followed by increasingly larger amounts as they gained confidence in their ability to manipulate my emotions. Armed with the bank records, I began my own detective work, starting with simple internet searches that revealed information they'd assumed I'd never think to look for. Michael's marketing business had a website that showcased recent successful campaigns and client testimonials, hardly the struggling venture he'd described when explaining why they needed financial help. A quick search of social media, which they'd underestimated my ability to navigate, revealed photos of expensive restaurant meals, weekend getaways, and shopping trips that painted a picture of people living well beyond the modest means they'd claimed. Jessica's Instagram account was particularly revealing, filled with pictures of spa days, designer purchases, and lunches at upscale restaurants, all taken during the hours when she was supposedly job hunting or attending her fictitious pottery classes. The timestamps on these posts corresponded perfectly with the dates when they'd received my checks for various emergencies, making it clear that my generosity had been funding their entertainment rather than their survival. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source, a conversation I overheard Sophie having with her stuffed animals during what she thought was private playtime in her room. Children, I've learned, process their world through play, and as I listened to her staging elaborate scenarios with her toys, I heard her reenacting arguments between her parents about money, discussions about keeping grandma happy, and even practicing the sad face she was supposed to make when they needed to ask me for something. "Now you have to look really, really sad," she instructed her favorite teddy bear, "and tell Grandma that we might have to move away if she doesn't help us with the special money we need." The innocence with which she repeated these coached lines broke my heart and simultaneously filled me with rage at the adults who had turned her childhood into a performance designed to manipulate her grandmother's love. That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I was going to give them exactly what they thought they wanted, but on my terms and with my own agenda. Instead of confronting them immediately with what I'd discovered, I decided to let them believe their manipulation was working perfectly while I prepared a much more comprehensive response to their deception. I began to play their game better than they could, expressing enthusiasm for their requests while carefully documenting every lie, every contradiction, and every moment when their mask slipped to reveal their true intentions. When Jessica mentioned needing money for a job interview outfit, I not only agreed to pay for it, but suggested we go shopping together, knowing full well that her social media posts would reveal what she actually spent the money on. When Michael claimed his car needed expensive repairs, I offered to drive him to the mechanic and pay the bill directly, watching his panic as he scrambled to explain why that wouldn't be necessary. The beauty of my new strategy was that their own greed began to work against them as they grew bolder and more careless, convinced that they had me completely under their control. Jessica started making increasingly elaborate requests, confident that I'd say yes to anything that claimed to benefit Sophie or strengthen our family bond. Michael began dropping hints about larger financial needs on the horizon, testing my willingness to consider major investments in their future. They started discussing their plans more openly, assuming that my age and apparent gullibility meant I wouldn't understand the implications of their conversations. What they didn't realize was that every word they spoke in my presence was being carefully cataloged in my mind. Every request was being documented with dates and amounts, and every lie was being verified through my own independent research. They thought they were playing a foolish old woman, but in reality, they were providing me with all the evidence I would need to expose their scheme and protect myself from their ongoing manipulation. By the end of that week, I had assembled a comprehensive picture of their deception that went far beyond simple financial fraud. They had created an elaborate false reality designed to exploit my grief, my loneliness, and my love for my family, turning my own home into a stage where they performed caring devotion while privately laughing at my supposed gullibility. But they had made one crucial mistake in their calculation. They had underestimated the strength, intelligence, and protective instincts of a woman who had survived 7 decades of life's challenges and wasn't about to be destroyed by her own son's greed. The time had come to show them that this particular grandmother was much more dangerous than they had ever imagined. With my evidence carefully gathered and my strategy crystallized, I began to set a trap that would expose their true nature while protecting both myself and Sophie from the fallout of their inevitable anger and desperation. The plan required patience, precision, and a performance of my own that would rival their 18 months of deception. But I had advantages they couldn't possibly have anticipated. First, I had the moral high ground and the legal right to make decisions about my own home and finances. Second, I had the documentation to prove their lies and manipulation. Most importantly, I had something they'd lost long ago: genuine love and concern for Sophie's well-being, which meant I was fighting for something more meaningful than money or comfort. The trap I designed was elegantly simple in its concept, but devastating in its execution. I decided to offer them something they'd been working toward all along: a chance to secure their financial future through my generosity, but with conditions that would force them to reveal their true intentions. I called a family meeting for Sunday afternoon, explaining that I'd been doing some thinking about our living arrangement and wanted to discuss some important decisions about the future. The anticipation in their eyes was unmistakable as they gathered in the living room, probably expecting another opportunity to manipulate my emotions and extract more money from my accounts. Sophie settled onto the floor with her coloring books, innocent and unaware that this conversation would determine the course of all our lives. "I've been thinking about how grateful I am to have you all here with me," I began, watching their faces carefully as I delivered lines I'd rehearsed in my mirror for days. "This house feels alive again with family in it, and I can't imagine going back to rattling around here by myself." Michael and Jessica exchanged glances that they thought were subtle, but I caught the flash of satisfaction in their expressions. "So I've decided that I want to make this arrangement permanent and ensure that you're all taken care of financially." Jessica actually gasped with what appeared to be genuine emotion, reaching over to squeeze my hand as she murmured something about how touched she was by my generosity. Michael nodded solemnly, playing the role of the grateful son who was overwhelmed by his mother's love and support. "I want to add both your names to the house deed," I continued, watching their excitement build with each word. "And I'm prepared to establish a substantial trust fund that will provide monthly income for your family, along with a lump sum that should cover any emergency expenses you might face." The amounts I mentioned were significant enough to make their eyes widen with greed, large enough to represent the kind of financial security they'd been scheming to obtain through their manipulation. Jessica actually had tears in her eyes as she talked about how much this meant to them, how they'd never take my generosity for granted, and how they'd spend the rest of their lives making sure I felt loved and appreciated. Michael spoke about family loyalty, about taking care of each other, and about how proud he was to be my son and Gerald's legacy. But then I delivered the conditions that would expose everything. Of course, such a significant financial commitment requires some legal protections for everyone involved, I said in the same gentle tone I'd been using all along. "My attorney will need to conduct some basic financial background checks to ensure the trust is structured properly, and will need to document your current assets and debts for estate planning purposes. It's all routine legal work, but necessary to make sure everything is handled correctly." I watched the color drain from their faces as they realized what financial disclosure would mean for their elaborate web of lies. Every fabricated emergency, every false claim of hardship, every manipulative sob story would be exposed when a lawyer started examining their real financial situation. "Also," I continued, "since this involves Sophie's future security, Child Protective Services recommends that families in these situations complete a basic home study to ensure the child's welfare is being properly protected. It's just a formality, really, but they'll need to interview Sophie privately about her living situation and general happiness." Michael and Jessica looked like they were going to be sick as they realized that their emotional manipulation of their daughter, their coaching of her responses, and their use of her as a prop in their scheme would all come to light under professional scrutiny. The very child they'd been using to manipulate my emotions would become the witness to their deception. The final condition was the most important. I think it would be wonderful if we could all spend more time together as a family before making these permanent arrangements. So I'd like to plan a month-long vacation where we can really bond and make sure this is the right decision for everyone. We could rent a house somewhere beautiful, maybe by the ocean, where Sophie could play on the beach and we could have quality time without the distractions of daily life here. I suggested we leave in 2 weeks, giving them just enough time to panic about the implications of extended close quarters with someone who was now actively watching for their deceptions. A month of constant supervision, without the ability to disappear for their secret activities or maintain their false narratives, would be impossible for them to navigate without exposing their true nature. As I watched them struggle to respond enthusiastically to conditions that would destroy their scheme, I felt a cold satisfaction in seeing the trap close around them. They couldn't refuse my generous offer without revealing that they weren't interested in family closeness, only in my money. They couldn't agree to the legal and social service requirements without exposing their lies and manipulation. And they couldn't commit to a month of intensive family time because they couldn't maintain their false personas under constant scrutiny. For the first time in 18 months, they were the ones caught off guard, scrambling to find responses that wouldn't reveal their true intentions. The hunters had become the hunted, and they were beginning to realize that the foolish old woman they'd been playing was actually much more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. The beauty of a perfectly set trap is watching your prey struggle against it while knowing that every move they make only tightens the constraints around them. Over the next few days, Michael and Jessica's behavior became increasingly erratic as they tried to find a way out of the corner they'd backed themselves into without revealing their true motives or losing access to my financial resources. Their conversations, which I now monitored much more carefully, became heated, whispered arguments about how to handle my unexpected conditions without destroying their carefully constructed facade. Jessica wanted to refuse the legal requirements outright, claiming they were invasive and unnecessary, but Michael understood that such a response would seem suspicious and potentially destroy their relationship with me entirely. Michael favored trying to delay the process indefinitely, hoping to find excuses for why the legal work couldn't be completed right away. But Jessica was terrified that prolonged scrutiny would expose details of their deception that they'd forgotten to cover. Their treatment of Sophie became even more disturbing as they realized she represented the greatest threat to their scheme. I began to notice them coaching her more intensively about what to say to adults, reminding her constantly about family privacy and the importance of not sharing family business with outsiders. They started bribing her with special treats and privileges when she demonstrated that she understood their expectations, and I caught them having conversations with her about how some people might try to ask her confusing questions that she shouldn't answer. The psychological pressure they were putting on this innocent child to protect their fraud made my determination to expose them even stronger, because I realized that their manipulation of Sophie was a form of abuse that would only get worse if I allowed their scheme to continue. The breaking point came exactly 1 week after my family meeting, when Jessica made a critical error that revealed just how desperate they'd become. She approached me while I was gardening, her face carefully arranged in an expression of concern and regret, and launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech about having second thoughts about my generous offer. "Margaret, I've been thinking about what you proposed, and while we're incredibly grateful, I'm worried that it might be too much responsibility for us," she began, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "We love living here with you, but maybe we should focus on becoming more independent instead of accepting such a large financial commitment." She talked about not wanting to be a burden, about the importance of earning their own way in life, and about how they'd rather continue with our current arrangement than risk changing something that was working so well for everyone. What she didn't realize was that this speech revealed everything I needed to know about their true priorities and their awareness of what the legal scrutiny would expose. She was trying to withdraw from the permanent arrangement I'd offered while keeping the current system of financial manipulation intact, which proved that they had never been interested in genuine family closeness or long-term commitment. They wanted to continue extracting money from me through emotional manipulation without the legal obligations and oversight that would come with a legitimate family arrangement. Her carefully worded rejection of my generous offer was actually a confession that they couldn't survive the investigation that legitimate generosity would require. I let her finish her performance, nodding sympathetically as she explained all the reasons why they couldn't accept my gift, before delivering the response that would end their game forever. "I understand your concerns, Jessica, and I appreciate your honesty," I said gently, setting down my gardening tools and giving her my full attention. "But I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about our current arrangement that we need to clear up." Her face went pale as she realized that something in my tone had changed, that the gentle, malleable grandmother she thought she'd been managing was suddenly speaking with a different kind of authority. "You see, I know about the pottery classes you never attended, the car repairs that were never needed, the medical bills that were never real, and the job interviews that never happened. I know about the restaurant meals and shopping trips funded by my emergency payments, and I know about the coaching sessions where you've been teaching Sophie to manipulate my emotions." The blood drained from Jessica's face as she realized that her carefully constructed world was collapsing around her, but I wasn't finished. "I also know about the conversations you and Michael have been having about my inheritance, about how easy it is to manipulate a lonely old woman, and about your long-term plans to ensure that you inherit everything when I die." Her mouth opened and closed wordlessly as she struggled to find a response that could somehow salvage the situation. But we both knew that no explanation could cover the depth of deception I'd discovered. "Most importantly, I know about the psychological manipulation you've been subjecting Sophie to, turning her into an unwilling accomplice in your fraud and teaching her that love is something to be performed for financial gain." I stood up from my gardening, brushing the dirt from my hands as I looked directly into her eyes with an expression that made her take a step backward. "So, here's what's going to happen. You and Michael have exactly 1 week to find another place to live and remove yourselves from my home. Sophie will remain here with me while you figure out your living situation, because I won't allow her to be subjected to the kind of environment where children are coached to lie and manipulate their grandparents." Jessica started to protest, started to deny everything, and claim that I was misunderstanding innocent conversations, but I held up my hand to silence her. "I have documented evidence of your deception, including recordings of your private conversations about how to exploit my loneliness and grief. Any attempt to fight this decision or claim rights to my property will result in me taking this evidence to the police and pursuing fraud charges against both of you." The woman who had spent 18 months performing the role of grateful daughter-in-law finally dropped her mask completely, her face twisting with rage and entitlement as she realized that her scheme had been exposed and her financial security was disappearing. "You can't do this to us," she snarled, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before but suspected had always been lurking beneath her false sweetness. "We've given up everything to take care of you. We've sacrificed our independence to keep you from being lonely, and this is how you repay us?" The absurdity of her claims, the complete reversal of reality where they were somehow the victims of my ingratitude, confirmed everything I'd learned about their manipulative nature and their complete inability to take responsibility for their own choices. The final week of Michael and Jessica's residence in my home was a masterclass in watching manipulative people desperately cycle through every strategy in their arsenal when they realize their primary target is no longer vulnerable to their tactics. Michael alternated between tearful apologies where he claimed temporary insanity due to financial stress, angry accusations where he blamed me for enabling their dependence by being too generous too quickly, and calculated attempts to negotiate a gradual departure that would give them time to find another vulnerable target. Jessica tried everything from fake medical emergencies designed to gain sympathy, to threats about keeping Sophie away from me permanently, to offers to pay back some of the money if I'd let them stay and continue our arrangement on modified terms. Both of them seemed genuinely shocked that their emotional manipulation techniques, which had worked so effectively for 18 months, were now powerless against someone who finally understood their true nature. Sophie, meanwhile, was experiencing her own revelation as she watched her parents' careful facades crumble and realized that the tension she'd been feeling for months finally made sense. Children are remarkably resilient when they're removed from toxic situations, and within days of her parents' departure, she began to relax in ways that made me realize how much stress she'd been carrying. She started talking more freely about her feelings, sharing stories about times when her parents had argued about money or coached her to say specific things to me, and gradually opening up about her confusion when the adults around her said one thing but clearly felt another. The honesty and innocence that had made her reveal their deception in the first place flourished when she no longer had to navigate the complex emotional manipulation that had defined her home environment. The legal proceedings that followed their departure were surprisingly straightforward, partly because I had documented their deception so thoroughly, and partly because their own desperation led them to make mistakes that confirmed their guilt. Michael attempted to claim that I owed them compensation for the work they'd done around the house and the care they'd provided for me, but the evidence I'd gathered showed that they'd actually contributed very little to household maintenance, while consuming far more resources than they'd provided. Jessica tried to argue that she should retain some custody rights over Sophie, but the recordings I'd made of them coaching her to manipulate my emotions, combined with Child Welfare Services' assessment of their financial instability and dishonesty, made it clear that Sophie was better off in my stable, loving home. The judge who reviewed the case was particularly disturbed by their use of their own child as a tool in their financial fraud, noting that such behavior demonstrated a fundamental inability to prioritize their daughter's welfare over their own immediate gratification. What surprised me most during this process was discovering how many other people had suspected that something wasn't right about Michael and Jessica's situation, but hadn't known how to address their concerns. Neighbors mentioned that they'd noticed expensive purchases and luxury activities that seemed inconsistent with a family experiencing financial hardship. Friends who had known Michael since childhood admitted that they'd been puzzled by his dramatic change in work ethic and his apparent comfort with living off his mother's generosity. Even some of Jessica's acquaintances had questioned the constant stream of financial emergencies that always seemed to resolve themselves after family meetings with me. The social worker assigned to Sophie's case told me that the coaching behaviors I documented were classic signs of emotional manipulation that she'd seen in other families where children were being used as tools in adult financial schemes. 6 months after Michael and Jessica's departure, my life had settled into a rhythm that felt more peaceful and authentic than anything I'd experienced since Gerald's death. Sophie had enrolled in a new school closer to my house, where she was thriving academically and socially, without the stress of having to perform specific emotional roles for her parents' benefit. Our daily routines were simple but genuine: homework at the kitchen table, evening walks around the neighborhood, weekend trips to museums and parks, and quiet bedtime conversations where she could share her thoughts and feelings without worrying about how they might be used against her or me. The house that had felt like a stage for elaborate performances now felt like a real home again, filled with honest affection and mutual respect instead of calculated manipulation and hidden agendas. Michael and Jessica have made several attempts to re-establish contact, usually coinciding with times when they're facing financial difficulties or when they think enough time has passed for me to have forgotten their deception. Their communications follow predictable patterns: initial apologies that blame their behavior on external stress, claims that they've learned from their mistakes and want to make amends, and gradual escalation to demands for financial assistance or threats about Sophie's custody when their appeals to my emotions fail to work. I respond to none of these attempts, having learned that engaging with manipulative people only provides them with information they can use to refine their future tactics. My lawyer handles any legal communications, and my focus remains entirely on providing Sophie with the stable, honest environment she deserves. The most important lesson I've learned from this experience is that genuine love and manipulative behavior are fundamentally incompatible, and that protecting yourself from emotional predators isn't selfish. It's necessary for preserving your ability to offer authentic support to people who truly deserve it. Sophie's simple observation that her parents were only nice when I was watching revealed a profound truth about the difference between performed affection and real care. Now, at 75 years old, I understand that wisdom isn't just about recognizing deception when it's happening. It's about having the courage to act on that recognition, even when it means disappointing people you love. Sophie and I have built something beautiful together in this house that Gerald and I once shared, something based on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine affection rather than financial obligation or emotional manipulation. Every morning when she bounds down the stairs for breakfast, every afternoon when she shares stories about her school day, every evening when we work on puzzles together at the dining room table, I'm reminded that real family relationships don't require performance or pretense. They exist in the small, everyday moments of caring for each other without expecting anything in return except the joy of being together. I've also learned that protecting one person sometimes means disappointing others, and that the temporary pain of setting boundaries is nothing compared to the long-term damage of enabling destructive behavior. Michael and Jessica are still struggling with the consequences of their choices, but they're finally learning to solve their own problems instead of manipulating others to solve them for them. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to rescue them from the natural results of their actions, even when they're your own child. As I watch Sophie grow into a confident, honest young woman who understands that love is something you give freely rather than something you perform for rewards, I know that Gerald would be proud of the choices I've made. This house is once again filled with genuine laughter, authentic conversations, and the kind of peace that comes from living with people who value you for who you are rather than what you can provide. And when Sophie whispers, "I love you, Grandma," at bedtime, I know she means it completely, without conditions or hidden agendas, because I've taught her through my own actions that real love never requires a performance.